Ask any 99er what the must-have carts are for TI-99 4A, and 9 out of 10 times, one of the first carts you'll hear mentioned is going to be Extended Basic. There's no one cart that does everything on the TI-99, but as far as official carts go, XP gets as close as anything does. With one cart, your TI-99 can finally do everything a TI-99 ought to be able to do in Basic. Now, I did recently look at the opposite of all that, when I looked at what you can do with the TI-99's built-in BASIC, and what you can play on the TI-99, with no upgrades and no carts even. This time, though, I want to show you what a TI-99 can do in a BASIC where upgrades are put to good use, and you've actually got access to the features that probably should have been on offer right from the get-go. The get-go being 1979 when the TI-99 4 made its debut. For the first couple years there, TI Basic was the only way for an average user to make TI-99 software. And people did do some pretty cool stuff with TI Basic. But in the long run, Extended Basic made it a whole lot easier to do much cooler things on the TI-99. Extended Basic is faster than TI Basic. It lets basic programs use the speech synthesizer.
I am a TI computer.
It can peek and poke system RAM. It can load assembly subroutines. And it can do a lot more graphically. Mainly, it can create and control sprites. When the TI-99 hit the market, hardware sprites really were a feature worth showing off. But out of the box on the TI-99, there was no way to show them off using the tools the system gave you. In TI Basic, any kind of animation usually just has to be one tile at a time, and consequently ends up looking like a bit of a slideshow. With no way to display or animate sprites, swapping a couple tiles a few times a second is about the best you can do. But sprites were something the system could do, so in the long run, they were something BASIC developers absolutely needed to have access to. Thankfully, XP made sprites available to anyone with the TI-99. Just use XB's call sprite command to make yourself a sprite, and presuming you don't do anything fancier than that, what you get is an 8x8 sprite moving in whatever direction you like, at whatever speed you like. Motion for sprites is handled in the background on a fire-and-forget kind of basis. So with motion happening automatically, your basic program's free to handle anything else it might like to do, visually or otherwise. So clearly, you can get a lot fancier than just sending an 8x8 graphic moving across the screen. First off, you can use the call magnify command to set magnification to 2. And you get double the sprite scale. Magnified sprites are used quite a bit in the title screens for Extended Basic games, since it's a great way both to make a big title and to provide it some animation too. You don't see these magnified sprites all that often outside Extended Basic, but Moon Patrol's one game that takes advantage of them. And for me, those chunky graphics do fit the cartoony feel of the game well. But Moon Patrol's car isn't a magnified 8x8 sprite, it's a magnified 16x16 sprite. And you can create one of those in XP by setting magnification to 4. Then you define the sprite with 4 8x8 patterns instead of 1. So that's a pretty big detailed game graphic, and you'll see those in XP games a fair bit. All in all, you can create 28 sprites in XP, less than the 32 the hardware can manage, but still a pretty good number. And the TI-99 will display up to 4 of those per scan line. When there are more than 4 sprites on a scan line, the lower priority sprites will just disappear. The higher the sprite number in XP, the lower the priority. So a sprite's number ends up being pretty important. It doesn't just decide which sprite gets dropped. More importantly, it also decides which sprite appears in front of which others. And that means you can layer sprites. So here we've got our original magnified 16 by 16 character sprite, with another 16 by 16 sprite in behind representing his eyes. But if we've got characters moving around, we probably want to animate them, at least some of the time. And you can do that by using the call pattern command to change the sprite pattern on the fly. Doing that, we've now got our character animated a bit while he flies across the screen. And finally, you probably aren't going to be happy with your character just moving in a line all the time. So we can use the call motion command to change our character's motion on the fly. And now he's got a slightly more complex movement pattern. So Extended Basic gives you a nice taste of what you can do with sprites on the TI-99. Though there are still some serious limitations. Changes to sprite motion with call motion aren't quite immediate, so complicated multi-sprite characters can be pretty buggy. And call coinc as a collision detection solution is probably the biggest issue when it comes to Extended Basic sprite handling. It's just not fast and accurate enough to catch collisions reliably. So in a game like this one, the game looks and feels pretty good, but it's a coin flip whether any given hit actually gets detected, which, needless to say, is not ideal. But having sprites is a hell of a lot better than not having them. So even if Extended Basic added nothing but sprites, well, it would still be a must-have card in my books, given how useful they are in games. Even a dead simple sprite game like Black Tunnel here gives you in 55 lines of Extended Basic, something you just couldn't get out of TI Basic no matter what you did. Much less than 55 lines. And sprites aren't just great as character graphics, they're a great way to do scrolling backgrounds too. Since now you can smoothly move terrain features or background features across the screen underneath a character. So, sprites are a pretty big deal. But if you watched my channel for a while, you know TI Speech Synth is my favorite thing to mess around with in BASIC. And XB has got us covered there. The voice of the TI-99, and just the fact that it has a voice at all, is a pretty big part of its identity. From the speech synth in its games,
Onward and upward.
to the speech synth music I and a few other lunatics have insisted on making over the years.
Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Remember me to one who lives there. She once was a true love of mine.
Speech came to TI Basic twice, really, in two different ways. It came via Speech Editor, which added the call say command to BASIC, and then it came with Terminal Emulator 2, which added an even cooler set of speech options, which let the TI-99 say pretty much anything you could imagine, any way you can imagine. For its part, XB added a modified version of Speech Editor's call say, and in XB that can do two things, both of them pretty handy. First, it can play vocabulary from the speech synthesizer's ROM like this.
I am a TI-99.
But second, and in the long run more importantly, it can play any speech sample fed to it from a BASIC variable. Which is how in TI's Star Trek game TI Trek, TI was able to include words like Klingons and phasers that the speech synthesizer's ROM doesn't normally know.
Computer firing phasers at Klingon.
And that's also how I added samples from the Star Trek TV show to my own spin on that game.
Deliver and sound yellow alert.
Call say can't do everything Terminal Emulator 2 can, but it's a better tool for injecting speech into a game, since it's quicker and less CPU intensive. so your game can go on playing even while the computer says whatever it has to say.
1, 2, 3, 4.
For an extra performance boost, you can even use XP's call sbget command to pre-fetch speech samples from ROM, which speeds things up hugely and gets rid of most of the performance hit from using speech.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
But these days, you can get the most out of call say by making your own speech samples like I did for my TI Trek hack. And the best tool for generating those right now is Blue Wizard. Feed Blue Wizard wave files with slow enough, clear enough, isolated speech, and it'll give you TI synth. Though there is something to be said for the classic TI speech synth voice from the ROM vocabulary.
Hello.
That's some pretty potent nostalgia there. Anyway, I've talked a fair bit about performance here, so let's take a look at the performance of XP, which is another big advantage it has over TI Basic. With the basic TI built into ROM, performance is always your biggest limitation. It does have the tools to make cool looking games in principle, it just isn't fast enough to make them playable most of the time. Extended Basic doesn't make those limits entirely a thing of the past, but it sure does improve things across the board, especially in areas that matter for games. The call joist and call key commands for reading input get some tweaking, and in Extended Basic they're now twice as fast, in my testing anyway. Writing a character to screen with call hchar meanwhile is almost 3 times as fast. Printing a full screen row is almost twice as fast. And setting palettes with call color is 3 times as fast. In the world of TI Basic, games running about half as fast as you'd like them to is just a fact of life. But in Extended Basic, with that 2 to 3 times speed boost, to specifically the commands games use most, well, things end up just about right for those classic games. So even if you write games exactly the way you did under TI Basic, or even if you're just playing the same old type-in games, well, Extended Basic has a huge advantage. But hopefully, you're not just going to write programs exactly the way you did under TI Basic, and you're going to take advantage of the new tools Extended Basic gives you. One thing that was painfully slow in TI Basic was writing strings to anywhere other than the bottom of the screen, since that needs to be done one character at a time with call hchar. XP improves that situation in a couple ways. First, by making call hchar way faster, but second, by adding display at, which lets you quickly write an entire string to anywhere inside the 28 by 24 print area, which is hugely more efficient than using call hchar, the good old bad old TI Basic way. So XP gives you better versions of existing commands, and it gives you new commands that fill the gaps in what TI Basic could do. But at some point you might wish you could add commands of your own, too. And XP has you covered there, too, with its support for assembly subroutines. Now, fair warning, to use assembly subroutines in XP, you do need the 32K memory expansion, since without that 32K, the TI-99 only has 256 bytes of memory the CPU can address, and most of that is already in use. With the 32K though, assembly subroutines can speed up the parts of your basic program that need a boost. So when the classic TI RPG Legends wants to set up a monster encounter, it's going to work out the details of the encounter in XP, but then it's going to set up the fancy graphics with assembly. The kind of philosophic question arising out of this is, how much of my program do I need to replace with assembly before it's just not a basic program anymore? And I'm not sure exactly where to draw the line there, but the slippery slope does lead somewhere interesting, and that is to programs that really do just use Extended Basic as a loader for pure assembly. Thing is, if you have an XP file called load on disk 1, when you start XP, it'll just auto-run. So this turns into a nice way to load TI software from disk. Just pop the disk in, select XP, and away you go. So, on the one hand, XP lets you take advantage of the 32K to run assembly programs. But, on the other hand, BASIC itself gets something out of that extra memory too, since all that extra space is available to you to write larger and more complex BASIC programs. With a cassette program for TI BASIC, all that data just gets dumped into however much of the VDP 16K of RAM is available, which is usually between 12K and 13K. So adding the 32K gives BASIC a lot more to work with. But great as that is, another feature of XP lets it go even further, and lets it create pretty much infinitely large programs. And that feature is the run command. With the run command letting extended BASIC programs call and run other BASIC programs, you can create an effectively endless conga line of BASIC programs if you want to. And some folks absolutely did. Old Dark Caves 2 is one of the biggest XP programs of the 80s, and it's made up of 6 main extended BASIC programs that run different parts of the game in the world and pass control back and forth by loading programs from disk on the fly. But as nice as the luxuries of disk-based gaming are, not many average TI-99 users had disks back in the day. So while XP really does make upgraded TI-99s everything they ought to be, it also comes with some caveats, especially if you haven't got those upgrades. With the 32K, XP does let you use that space to write bigger programs. But the flip side of that is, without the 32K, you have even less memory to work with than TI BASIC gave you. So your programs are going to need to be smaller in that case, not larger. And a second way you'll be limited without the 32K is, without the 32K, as I say, assembly subroutines in XP aren't an option. Mini-memory's the cart for folks who want to mess around with assembly without needing any expansion hardware at all. In XP, no memory expansion, well, no machine code for you. And one more limitation XP throws at you is it actually takes away 2 character sets you had access to in BASIC, 15 and 16. You'll run into errors pretty regularly trying to run TI BASIC programs in XP when they inevitably try to set patterns and colors for those unavailable characters. But like I said, with the upgrades, the sky's the limit, since with assembly support, you don't need to worry about BASIC denying you anything. You can just write your own code or borrow someone else's to use the system however you please. Extended BASIC gives you easy-to-use speech so that anyone at all can use call say to get basic talking using the default vocabulary.
Help me, I am inside the computer and I cannot get out.
But at the same time, XP lets you use custom speech patterns loaded from disk. So there's no limit to what your TI speech synth can sound like, if you put in the extra work.
Enterprise, this is the captain. The deliver and sound yellow alert. Aegis locked and register. Weapon status, Mr. Scott. No effect, Captain. Tribbles are all over my ship.
Then we've got sprites, and all the commands and controls to use those in interesting ways. They might not always be as responsive as you'd like, and collision detection can be kind of flaky. But it's so much better than not having them at all. Plus, we've got the ability to make way bigger programs and integrate object code routines. So we can speed things up or do things extended BASIC itself doesn't otherwise let us do at all. But probably the most convincing selling point for XP is just that it's so much faster than TI BASIC right from the get-go. Even if you have absolutely no interest in using any of the tools Extended BASIC gives you, it'll make your BASIC programs run faster than ever before. So, did you write any good Extended BASIC games back in the day yourself? Ever imagine yourself writing the next great TI RPG by reinventing Tunnels of Doom in XP? Or, for that matter, did you have any favorite XP programs you ran into or typed in from the magazines? As always, I'd love to hear about them. After all, a look at the very best in extended basic programs might just be coming from me down the line. So keep an eye out for that. And subscribe if you'd like to keep up with my TI-99 content down the line. Thanks for watching, folks. And keep on partying like it's TI-99.